I'm Afshin Rattansi, and you're watching a very special episode of Going Underground, an interview with the USA's former UN ambassador, President Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton. He joins me now from Washington, D.C., and his memoir about his time in the White House, The Room Where It Happened, is out now. Ambassador, thanks so much for coming on. Horrific carnage news coming from Kunduz and Kandahar. You're actually the second national security advisor of Donald Trump to be on Going Underground. You say in your book, The Room Where It Happened, the Afghanistan deal, that's Trump's one, time will prove who is right, and the full extent of the deal may not become apparent until after Trump leaves office. What is your assessment as a former national security advisor of the Biden administration's foreign policy, especially on Afghanistan?
Well, I think this is one of the few instances where Biden and Trump agree on policy. Both wanted to get out of Afghanistan. Both ignored the consequences I think many people thought were foreseeable. What Biden did was take Trump's deal, which was flawed in many, many respects, and essentially adopted it as his own policy. He disregarded the advice of senior advisors in the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and I think the consequences have been plain to see. It's returned Afghanistan to control by the Taliban, and everything that's flowing from that, including the likelihood of foreign terrorists returning and again using Afghanistan as a base to plan terrorist operations around the world. So this is a retreat by the United States from the international stage, something Biden believed in since at least 2009. As I say, ironically, Trump believed in it too. I think it's a mistake for the U.S. I think it's a mistake for global stability. Certainly, it's a mistake for the people of Afghanistan.
Well, in fairness, Trump's deal, the date of withdrawal was May the 1st. You don't think that makes any difference?
No, look, I think all Biden did was extend it a couple months, and it just showed how little planning had been done either by the Trump administration or by Biden for the execution of the withdrawal itself. And I should note my own polling on this subject, I think, affirms what other people have observed, that while at the beginning many people said the withdrawal itself was executed poorly, and no question about that, but it's caused them to rethink the consequences of the withdrawal itself, the return of Taliban to power, the greater risk of terrorist attack. That obviously calls into question the legitimacy of the withdrawal decision fundamentally. I think people now realize we are less secure after the withdrawal than we were before the withdrawal.
You said that Biden changed in that answer in a way. What do you, I mean, he said when he was helping to confirm you at the State Department in 2001, my disagreements with you are that you are too competent. I wish you were ambassador. I wish you were dumb to get a better shot at you. You're competent and honorable. What do you think the president meant by, the now president meant by that?
I think I took it as a compliment, sort of a backhanded compliment to be sure. But look, I've been on the opposite side of Joe Biden on almost every major question in foreign policy for a long time. And I think that was a recognition we disagreed, and they didn't have the usual politics of personal destruction issues they could go after me on. So they had to try something else.
I don't think he's going to appoint you a national security advisor anytime soon, perhaps. The top objective in your book, as regards Afghanistan, you make clear, is to prevent the potential resurgence of ISIS. Just tell us what you think ISIS-K actually is, because we had Karzai's ex-finance minister, Oman Zakiwal, on the program, who negotiated actually with Biden in the past. He claimed that it was Trump's mother of all bombs, like a almost nuclear bomb that was dropped by Trump on Afghanistan, acted as a recruitment sergeant for ISIS. But is that ISIS or ISIS-K? This
is complicated. These different terrorist groups, terrorist factions don't have identity cards that they can show. I'm Al-Qaeda, I'm ISIS-K, I'm this. People drift back and forth. I think the main threat right now of regrouping terrorists in Afghanistan is Al-Qaeda. I think Al-Qaeda's never really left. I think they've been embedded with Taliban in their exile across the border in Pakistan for the last 20 years. And I think Al-Qaeda will take advantage of renewed Taliban control to recreate the sanctuaries, the rear base area that they used Afghanistan before. ISIS is a new phenomenon, but look, in Iraq and Syria, it was an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. And ISIS-K, which is the acronym for the ISIS affiliate that claims to control roughly the territory of Afghanistan is just another manifestation. The tragedy at the mosque you mentioned, a similar bombing occurred a few weeks ago. ISIS-K took credit for it. Both were Shiite mosques. ISIS-K, obviously fanatic Sunni terrorist group. But there's rivalry between ISIS-K and Taliban. But I could say rivalry today. I could see a coalition between them tomorrow. This is a changing environment in Afghanistan. Obviously, just a couple months ago, they were in exile across the border. Now they're in control in Kabul. I expect to see there to be further developments, but I think it's hard to predict. But what I would say is that this potential for congregating terrorists from anarchic areas around the world toward a more hospitable government in Afghanistan, I think is something we should all be worried about.
I mean, the Taliban obviously say they're sworn enemies with ISIS-K, and you seem to say that al-Qaeda are embedded within it. We've had the Taliban on this program. There are de facto negotiations going on between NATO governments and the Taliban. You mean they're kind of negotiating with al-Qaeda, more or less?
Well, I think there's a danger that, look, there's a big question whether there's a new moderate Taliban leadership or whether it's the same old crew that governed Afghanistan in the late 1990s. I think it's still early to make a final conclusion, but I think the early evidence is not very encouraging that moderate forces have somehow taken over with Taliban. And I think it's one of the reasons why even the Biden administration has been hesitant to unfreeze Afghan assets, turn them over to Taliban, to resume humanitarian assistance, until we find out whether they're still a terrorist group, as they seem to be, or whether there's something else. The Europeans, through the European Union, have jumped in a little bit early. I think they may come to regret that decision.
A lot of money they seem to be giving. I mean, some might say it was, after all, the United States and Britain that were trying to overthrow Assad of Syria. And that meant that, of course, alliances were made with groups affiliated to ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria. And, I mean, everyone knows the U.S. history and the history with the Mujahideen. Isn't this another case of terrible blowback, that ISIS-K is actually a kind of descendant of British and U.S. policy in Syria since 2011?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think what happened to take it back to the Iraq-Syria theater is that after Barack Obama withdrew American forces from Iraq in 2011, because really, what could go wrong? Everything was taken care of. That's when ISIS arose in western Iraq and eastern Syria, and we had to go back in to counter this new threat, a more virulent form of al-Qaeda. So I hardly think that it was in reaction to our withdrawal that we saw ISIS arise. I think it was the spread of this terrorist mentality, which still is sweeping the region.
Of course, one could say that then it's still a descendant of US and UK policy because of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, either way. But
well, maybe it all goes back to British imperialism in the 19th century.
Everything does, Ambassador. No, this is more recent, obviously, the 2001 war. I mean, before we leave Afghanistan, I should just quickly say, you have warned that a Taliban victory in Kabul gives them potential access to 150 nuclear weapons. What do you mean?
That was misquoted from an earlier interview. What I've said was I worry that the takeover by Taliban in Afghanistan could provide aid and comfort to radicals in Pakistan, Pakistani Taliban itself, other terrorist groups that the Pakistani government created, along with extremists in the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate and other parts of the Pakistani military. If those extremists took control in Pakistan, then that government would have access to the country's store of nuclear weapons.
Wait, Ambassador, so did you make that point when you were National Security Advisor, and what, no one listened to you, the potential for absolute catastrophe?
I did make that point several times. I thought it was a compelling reason to keep American and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Obviously, that was not persuasive to Donald Trump and wouldn't have been persuasive to Joe Biden.
Well, it's not necessarily meaning a continued occupation. It could mean other policies, but clearly that's a terrifying prospect. I should just, because we've got a trial here of Julian Assange coming up, you appointed Richard Grenell, is that right? Who took over as acting national security advisor when you left?
No, I didn't appoint him. Richard Grenell worked for me in New York. He was the spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN when I was UN ambassador.
Were you ever privy to this thing about Grenell and Trump organizing an Assange pardon deal if he revealed his sources?
That's news to me.
Well, I have to go to the actual bombing of Syria that you were National Security Advisor at the time. Some might say that also emboldened ISIS al-Qaeda in Syria, because you were de facto defending ISIS al-Qaeda in Syria. How do you look upon that attack on Syria in 2018?
We certainly weren't defending ISIS or anyone else.
They would have seen it that way.
Well, they would be wrong to see it that way. What happened was the Syrian government used chemical weapons, probably chlorine-based, against civilian targets in and around Damascus. Almost exactly 1 year earlier, in April of 2017, the Syrian government had done the same thing. The U.S. had responded militarily, and clearly Assad had not been deterred from engaging in that kind of conduct again. So this was actually started my first day in office, April the 9th, 2018. It was a busy week. But the British and the French came together with us. We did another retaliatory attack in response. I don't think that deterred Assad either. But to me, it was evidence that that the danger of the anarchy we saw in Syria, with the presence of Iranian forces, Hezbollah coming over from Lebanon to support the Assad regime, the accumulation of terrorist forces in and around Idlib, was a compelling reason to keep U.S. and NATO forces in northeastern Syria, which is another place Trump wanted to withdraw from. So this was part of the complex dealing within the Trump administration to maintain stability, which was in U.S. interest, rather than withdraw and see a return either to terrorist control or Iranian-backed control.
Yeah, you didn't mention, you mentioned the regional allies there. You didn't mention Russian troops. You don't think it was compelling when Mad Dog Mattis from the Pentagon said if that missile strike had killed Russian soldiers, it would have meant war with Moscow?
I don't know when Mattis said that, but I can tell you in preparation for this, it's in the context of that Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Joe Dunford called his Russian counterpart shortly before the strike in Syria, as he had done the year before, to say, look, you've seen what's happened here with this chemical weapons attack by the Assad government, and just want you to know that we're not going to sit idly by, so that you need to look out for your Russian forces. We understood fully, and I think that's what Mattis was saying, that if we were not careful, there might be collateral damage, which we didn't want. This was not in any sense aimed at Russia. It was aimed at the Assad regime.
Albeit that you said that Putin was lying about it not being a chemical attack. You also say in the book that...
Which they did, that's right. That was the Russian position, and that was incorrect, as I think all the evidence indicates.
Yeah, obviously very controversial. But you do mention in the book that Antonio Guterres, who slammed the strike for not having UN Security Council approval, he was being ridiculous. Kind of symptomatic of the fact, the lack of authority of the UN Secretary General and the UN now. You famously said you can demolish a whole load of floors in New York. It doesn't make any difference.
I think the organization is gridlocked, and its political institutions, sad to say, largely a failure. If we had gone to the Security Council, I think we almost certainly would have faced a Russian and Chinese veto. The administration had not gone for Security Council approval in 2017, and neither the British nor the French felt there was any need for Security Council approval. So I think we were well within our rights to conduct the strike without reference to the Security Council.
Ambassador Bolton, I'll stop you there. More from the 27th National Security Advisor of the United States after this break. Welcome back. I'm still here with the former U.S. Ambassador to the UN and the 27th U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton. Quite a lot of U.S. subsidy to the UN. I know that under Trump you got out of UNESCO. Biden took you back in. Did you advise as National Security Advisor that some of that U.S. subsidy to the UN should be reduced?
I've long felt, based on my tenure in New York as UN ambassador and other positions I've held, that the U.S. money is wasted in many respects, misspent in many respects. And my overall reform proposal for the UN is to abolish what are called assessed contributions, which are essentially mandatory. The U.S. pays around 22% of the budgets of most agencies. I'd make all contributions from national members of the UN. I'd make all contributions.
Yeah, but what happened to, I mean, there must be people all over the world, arguably, that would agree with all this. Why did you get nowhere with all of this?
The notion to make contributions voluntary, unfortunately, didn't have agreement all around the world. But I think if it did, it would be like a tsunami sweeping through the halls of the UN.
I mean, the UN Security Council, of course, ratified, and the US, the JCPOA. What prospects do you think, I mean, what's the delay since Biden got back in of the Iran nuclear deal? I know you're an opponent. I don't know whether you think the option is to attack Iran militarily. I'm not sure what your view is of Iran-US relations.
The Biden administration, for all public purposes, remains committed to trying to get back into the deal and to get Iran back into the deal. I think the deal was fatally flawed when it was agreed in 2015. It hasn't gotten any better with age. I think the regime in Tehran is committed to getting deliverable nuclear weapons. It's never showed any evidence whatever.
I think your views are well known, Ambassador, but what should the policy be now?
The best step forward, given how unpopular the Tehran regime is inside Afghanistan, is to find ways to split the top leaders in the Revolutionary Guards and the armed forces, and to reflect what is the widespread view among the population out in plenty of places where there aren't Western reporters reporting how unpopular the regime is, and see if it can't be overthrown, give the government to the people of Iran.
Using the Taliban. I thought it is quite popular in Afghanistan. Iran has obviously taken maybe 1 million refugees there, and Iran has been linked to the talks. I mean, obviously there are new Afghan talks happening in Moscow next week.
The regime in Iran, it's the unpopularity of the regime in Iran. I think that is it's only through regime change in Iran that you're going to get a strategic decision there not to pursue nuclear weapons.
But obviously the last time there was a successful regime change by the U.S. was against the democratically led Mossadegh. Bernie Sanders fond of talking about that. Isn't that how you got into this mess? I know Dulles is a big hero of yours. He was overseeing that one. With the British, I should say.
Well, we did it with the British, but it was actually Mossadegh who had violated the Iranian constitution at the time, and I think it was far more elements of popular opposition to Mossadegh's support for the Shah.
Yeah, but it led to the Islamist revolution of 1979.
No, it didn't. It followed it. That's you're engaging in the post hoc ergo proc fallacy.
You love that one. Now, I lived in Iran, I got to tell you, and sanctions didn't affect rich people in Iran. You're a vocal supporter of sanctions. I mean, do you know how many thousands of ordinary Iranians, men, women, and children, are killed by U.S. and NATO sanctions on Iran? You think it's a price worth paying, like Madeleine Albright with the 500,000 Iraqi children?
No, it's the sanctions have never been directed against medicine or food supplies.
You know the effects.
But the effects are caused by the mishandling of the Iranian economy, the corruption among even the mullahs themselves, who have grown, they and their families grown. Yeah,
but you know that's the case. If you accept that, are you not shoring up? I mean, Cuba is a good example here. You sanction a country, you create support for that government, whatever the color of that government is.
I think Cuba is a good example. The island's recently been swept by anti-regime demonstrations there, primarily from young people, and this is a significant, important
development. A few hundred in the streets, and it's completely quiet now?
Thousands all over the island.
I know in the book you're concerned about Venezuelan help for Cuba. The Washington think tank CEPR claims 40,000 children may be killed by sanctions on Venezuela. Why did you not want Trump to meet Maduro? apparently Trump expressed a desire to meet Maduro, and you treated this guy Guaido as a president. A very strange anecdote in your book about the wedding ring of Guaido's wife. You might have to explain that one.
Well, that's another Trump anecdote. Look, Trump had a feeling for authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un. Maduro was just part of that group of people, and I think he decided ultimately on his own he didn't want to do it. But the clear policy we had was to support the constitutional process in Venezuela, and the duly elected legislature had declared Maduro's fraudulent election invalid, and that therefore there was a vacancy in the presidency, which Juan Guaido was elected to fill, and we recognized that government. I might say this Constitution was written by Hugo Chavez in his early days. So
you've always supported Chavez, I know, Ambassador. That's why you did it. But
Western oppression.
But so you don't subscribe to Churchill's George Orr. I mean, Trump wants to speak to Maduro, the country with the largest known oil reserves. Why not, as his national security advisor, say, yeah, set up a meeting like the Kim Jong, well, maybe not like the Kim Jong-un one, obviously.
Yeah, no, look, the question is what is in the interest of the people of Venezuela and the interest of the United States? And I think we saw very clearly that Chavez and Maduro had driven the country into poverty. They had taken, as you say, a country with...
What's in the interest is the 40,000 people not being killed by U.S. sanctions.
Look, that is somebody's estimate. There's simply no evidence for that. It is the case that the medical system in Venezuela over a period of 20 years of Chavez-Maduro rule has been just devastated, and as has the economy more broadly.
Now, I know you were privy to the highest secrecy documents. You must have been, because Trump tried to take you to court for the book, just to check for the fifth time, I don't know, sixth time, that he hadn't leaked any secrets. But all those documents must show that China is headed to become the most economically powerful country of this century. Why are you against strategic arms limitation treaties, given that that would arguably give China carte blanche to make more nuclear warheads, more nuclear missiles than even the United States possesses today?
Well, we could talk about China's economic future. I think its statistics are inflated, to say the least, and I think it has enormous internal problems people don't recognize. But on the strategic weapons issue, what I've said is that I think we have to recognize that we're no longer in essentially a bipolar nuclear world, Russia and the United States. That was true in Cold War days. There were smaller nuclear powers, China, Britain, France, others. But in those days, if you were going to have arms control, it was a bipolar negotiation. Today, and we read in the newspapers from commercial satellite overhead of Chinese construction of hundreds of new ballistic missile silos, which are obviously being excavated to put in missiles carrying nuclear warheads. China's capabilities in the nuclear field are expanding enormously. So what I've said consistently when I was in the government before that and since I've left, if we're going to have new strategic weapons negotiations with Russia, China has to be included. It makes no sense whatsoever to pretend that we're still living in the Cold War bipolar nuclear era.
Except that policy has arguably moved Moscow and Beijing together. U.S. NATO policy has moved Moscow and Beijing closer than ever, as you know.
I don't think it's U.S. policy that's moved them closer together. I think they have grown closer. I think that's Moscow's choice. And I think it's a big mistake for Russia. I think Russia's got a lot of oil that it's happy to sell to China. It's got strategic weapons it's happy to sell to China. But I think Russia's making a very bad decision by casting its lot in the future for the rest of this century, potentially with China. I think it is in danger of losing, over a long period of time, control over much of Russia east of the Ural Mountains. I mean, you've got a country with a huge population and not many natural resources. South of Russia, with in that part a lot of natural resources and very few people. That doesn't bespeak long-term strategic stability from the Russian point of view. And I would just urge people in Russia who are thinking about this issue to think long and hard before they get too close to China.
Well, what would you say if you were Vladimir Putin's national security advisor, given there is a USS joint carrier strike fleet right now sailing to China's maritime borders, and even Boris Johnson is sending his aircraft carrier to China? I mean, as the bases increase, as the number of troops increase around Russia, as the navies of NATO approach China, wouldn't you be advising alliances with China?
I very strongly believe that it's not in Russia's long-term interest to get closer to China. By splitting away from the potential for closer relations with the West that we had after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think we've lost a lot of time and opportunity. And,
yeah, but wait. Russia tried that, and as we know, the agreement with Gorbachev was broken, and we've seen U.S. policy as regards Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. We've seen what NATO thinks of relations with Russia. It's measured in blood.
Defensive alliance. NATO remains a defensive alliance, and I would just say, and perhaps you and I should discuss this at greater length in a future broadcast. I think Russia's greatest security lies in moving west, not moving east.
I've just got to finally ask then, obviously about the COVID pandemic. I don't know what you think the mistakes were by the Trump administration, whether you're writing maybe a sequel to this book about that element. But of course, criticism came for you. Why did you abolish the National Security Council's pandemic response unit just ahead of the COVID virus that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, millions around the world?
I didn't abolish it. I did something really bureaucratically quite responsible. I merged it with the Biological Weapons Unit of the National Security Council. And in fact, if you look both at Bob Woodward's book, if you look at reporting in the New York Times, the National Security Council staff, these very people, in early January 2020, were raising red flags about the dangers of COVID. They were doing exactly what they were intended to do. The problem was not a bureaucratic reshuffle within the NSC staff. It was Trump's unwillingness to take COVID seriously at the beginning because he worried it would affect his reelection efforts.
Do you see the world without a strategic arms limitation treaty as getting more dangerous or less dangerous?
Well, I think it depends on what countries like Russia and China want to do with their strategic weapons. I think Russia and the U.S. could find an accommodation. We did when I served George W. Bush as his Undersecretary of State for Arms Control. We signed the Treaty of Moscow in 2002, which reduced the operationally deployed strategic nuclear forces of both countries. I think that's possible again, but I think you cannot do that in the absence of having China participate.
But do you think Germany should boycott Nord Stream 2?
I do.
Simultaneously.
I think it's a mistake sure. I think it's a mistake to become strategically dependent on any particular source of energy. And this is something that Ronald Reagan warned Europe about in the 1980s.
John Bolton, thank you. And that's it for the show. We'll be back on Monday when we ask a former technical co-lead at Google about technological class war. Until then, keep in touch via social media and let us know what you thought of John Bolton's answers to our questions. Thanks for watching this Going Underground interview. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel with notifications on to never miss an interview. Now it's your turn. Tell us what you think by commenting below and getting in touch via our social media. See you next time. All that is solid melts into air.